It was a day like any other. At least that's how it seemed at first. The sun had barely risen, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping on my usual cup of coffee. My mornings were quiet now, almost too quiet. It had been nearly a year since Brianna left, and in her absence I had grown used to the silence. She was a lawyer, sharp, ambitious, the kind of woman who could command a room without even raising her voice. So our marriage had been a whirlwind, a storybook romance that soured too soon, falling apart under the weight of her late nights at the firm and my long hours managing the factory. I thought I could get over it, that the divorce was just another bump in the road. But everything changed when Maggie and Stokely came into my life. I had never expected to find anyone rummaging through my trash, let alone two young women. They looked rough, barely out of their teens, with clothes too thin for the chilly autumn air. Maggie, the older one, had a look of defiance in her eyes, while Stokely, her younger sister, was more cautious, her eyes darting around like a frightened animal. I should have just told them to leave, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Maggie held her sister close, protective despite her own vulnerability, or maybe I was just tired of the emptiness in my house. It brought them inside that night. Fed them, listened as they shared their story, parents long gone, kicked out of their last place because they couldn't pay rent. It was tough to hear, but there was something in their eyes, a flicker of hope, that made me feel like I could help, and I wanted to help. God, did I need to feel like I could fix something again? Well, it didn't take long before I became attached to them. We settled into an odd routine, me going to work, them staying behind to clean up or cook dinner. It was like having a family again. I'd come home and Maggie would be in the kitchen, asking me how my day was, while Stokely would shyly show me something she'd drawn. The house felt alive, in a way it hadn't in years. But as much as I tried to focus on them, a part of me couldn't shake the shadow of Brianna. Brianna, she was always in the background, no matter how much I tried to move on. It's strange how the mind works, how it holds on to things even when you think you've let go. I remember the day she re-entered my life, like a storm blowing in on a clear day. She had called out of the blue, her voice as cold and detached as it always was during our final months together. "Would you wanted to talk?" she said. No strings attached, she assured me. I knew better than to trust her words, but curiosity got the better of me. When I saw her again, it was like a punch to the gut. She hadn't changed, still the same beautiful, successful woman who had once made me feel like I could conquer the world. But there was something in her eyes, a weariness that hadn't been there before. We met for coffee, and she talked about how she regretted the way things ended, how maybe, just maybe, we could give it another shot. I should have said no. Every part of me screamed that this was a bad idea. But I didn't. I guess part of me still loved her. Or maybe I just didn't want to be alone anymore. We started seeing each other again, slowly at first, like we were testing the waters. Brianna even came by the house a few times, met Maggie and Stokely. I could tell she was surprised. Maybe she hadn't expected me to have moved on in any way. But there was no hostility in her, no judgment. It was almost like she was testing me, seeing if this new life I had built was something she could fit into. Things moved fast after that. Brianna and I talked about the girls, how we could give them a better life together. She brought up the idea of adoption, something I hadn't even considered. I was just trying to keep my head above water, and now here she was talking about building a family, a real family. The more we talked about it, the more it made sense. Brianna had the resources, the connections, and despite everything, I knew she had a good heart under all that armor she wore. And we got remarried quietly, no big ceremony, just the two of us at the courthouse. Maggie and Stokely were there, and it felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. But for the first time in a long time, I settled. Brianna and I started the paperwork for the adoption, and everything seemed to be falling into place. So I should have known better. It too, looking back, there were signs subtle at first, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. Brianna was often distant, her phone glued to her hand more than usual. There were late nights at the office again, though she swore they were nothing like before. I tried to believe her. I tried to believe that we were different now that we had both changed. But those old feelings of unease crept back in, gnawing at me like they had during the worst of our first marriage. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maggie noticed too. She wasn't one to mince words, and one night, after Brianna had yet another late meeting, Maggie pulled me aside. "Are you sure she's telling you the truth?" she asked, her eyes sharp, cutting right through me. "So people don't change that easy, Mag, especially not her." So I brushed it off, told her she didn't know Brianna like I did. But deep down, I was starting to wonder if she was right. The distance between us was growing again, and I couldn't help but feel like I was falling back into the same trap. It was like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Little things started to stand out, whispers in the other room, quick glances at her phone, the way she'd smile at texts she never let me see. Then there was the time she didn't come home until the morning. I told myself it was a one-off, that maybe she had stayed at the office to finish a case. But the way she avoided eye contact, the way she hurried past me into the shower, it all felt too familiar. But I didn't push. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. Not yet. Not until the truth came crashing down, shattering everything I thought we had rebuilt. But that part of the story is still to come. For a while, things actually seemed good, almost normal, even. Brianna and I settled into a routine that felt familiar, comfortable in a way I hadn't expected. There were dinners together where she'd talk about her work and I'd share stories from the factory. Maggie and Stokely seemed to be getting used to Brianna being around again, though I could tell there was always a bit of tension in the air. Maggie especially wasn't shy about giving Brianna cold looks when she thought I wasn't watching. Stokely, on the other hand, kept to herself, avoiding conflict altogether. She was a quiet kid, always retreating into her sketchbooks, her artist safe space in a world that had been anything but kind to her. Still, Brianna played her part well. She acted like she was committed to this new life we were building, even going out of her way to spend time us. I'd take Stokely out shopping, come back with bags of art supplies and new clothes for her. With Maggie, things were more strained, but Brianna tried. She'd invite Maggie out to lunch or suggest they do something together. But Maggie always found a way to back out, like she didn't trust Brianna, like she could see through her. I chalked it up to Maggie's natural defiance, a way of protecting herself and Stokely from more hurt. Or a part of me wondered if maybe she was seeing something I wasn't. Work at the factory was grueling as always. I managed one of the larger plants in town, overseeing hundreds of workers and making sure production met the tight quotas corporate demanded. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and I liked the sense of control I had there. So at home, everything felt uncertain, but at the factory I knew what to expect. It was routine, mechanical, and in some ways, I found peace in that. But as the weeks went on, the peace started slipping through my fingers. So Brianna's late nights became more frequent, her excuses piling up like the papers on her desk. She'd tell me it was just the nature of her job. Big cases mean long hours, Mac. You know how this goes. And she wasn't wrong. I did know. I had lived through it once already. Saw the late nights, the hushed phone calls, the way she'd come home looking exhausted but different. It was like her body was here, but her mind was somewhere else. Somewhere I wasn't allowed to follow. I tried to ignore it, for the sake of the girls if nothing else. We were deep into the adoption process, and I wanted to believe we could still make this work. Brianna kept reassuring me that everything was fine, that we were on the right track. But the more she said it, the less I believed her. So Maggie kept pushing too. She'd corner me in the kitchen or the living room, her voice low but fierce. Something's off with her, Mac. You can't see it because you don't want to, but I do. People don't change that quick. I'd always brush her off, tell her to focus on herself and her sister, not to worry about Brianna. But deep down, I knew she was right. I just didn't want to admit it. One night, Brianna didn't come home at all. It was the first time since we got back together that she had stayed out the entire night. I stayed up late, waiting, pacing the living room like some kind of fool. Maggie sat with me for a while, silent but present, her expression unreadable. Stokely had gone to bed hours earlier, blissfully unaware of the growing storm in the house. Around 2 a.m., Maggie finally spoke. But she's not at work, right? I didn't answer. What could I say? I wanted to believe Brianna was buried under some mountain of legal paperwork, fighting to win a case, too busy to call. But the sinking feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I didn't want to face it, not yet. When Brianna finally came home the next morning, she acted like nothing was wrong. She gave me some bullshit excuse about having to stay overnight at the office because the client needed her there. Her voice was steady, her smile practiced, but I could see the cracks, and I could feel the distance between us growing larger with every word she said. Still, I didn't push. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this time would be different. I convinced myself that maybe I was just being paranoid, letting old wounds resurface because of how our first marriage had ended. Though maybe this was just part of the process of rebuilding what we had lost. But every time she smiled at her phone, every time she avoided my eyes, that sinking feeling came back, heavier and harder to ignore. The tension was getting to Maggie too. She started snapping at Brianna more often, her patience wearing thin. It wasn't long before Brianna stopped trying to win her over, retreating into herself, throwing her energy into her work or whatever she was doing late at night. Meanwhile, Stokely remained neutral, her drawings becoming more intricate and dark as the days went on. She was retreating into her own world, and I was afraid I might lose her too if things didn't settle down. I tried talking to Brianna about the adoption, hoping it would bring us closer, give us something positive to focus on. But every time I brought it up, she brushed it aside, saying we'd get to it when the time was right. So it wasn't like her. Brianna was always a woman of action, someone who never let things sit on the back burner. But now everything was a delay, a deflection, and the more she pushed things aside, the more my suspicions grew. I started watching her, noticing little things, how she'd keep her phone on silent, how she'd always step out of the room to take certain calls. When I asked her about it, she'd laugh it off, saying I was being ridiculous. But I knew her well enough to see when she was lying. I just didn't have the proof. Not yet. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was coming to a head. Something was going to break, and when it did, there'd be no going back. Maggie was right about one thing: people don't change that easily. And the Brianna I had fallen in love with all those years ago was starting to feel like a stranger. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the growing distance between us, it was all leading to something I wasn't ready to face. So sooner or later, the truth was going to come out, and when it did, everything we had rebuilt would crumble. I just didn't know how close that moment was. The day the truth came out wasn't anything special, at least not at first. It was just another Thursday, one of those grey, overcast days that makes everything feel heavier than it is. Work had been a mess with the factory running behind on production, and I came home late, feeling exhausted and worn thin. Brianna's car wasn't in the driveway, which wasn't surprising at this point, but it still stung every time. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, the kind of quiet that always made me uneasy. Maggie and Stokely were holed up in their room, probably watching something on Maggie's old laptop, but I could feel the tension in the air, like something was building, waiting to snap. I went into the kitchen, dropping my keys on the counter, and that's when I noticed Brianna's phone. It was sitting there on the kitchen table, face down like she had forgotten it in a rush. That wasn't like her. Brianna was glued to that thing, always texting or answering emails, always checking in with clients or whatever it was she said she was doing. Just stood there for a moment, staring at it, the weight of temptation settling in my chest. I knew what I was about to do was wrong. I knew it would only make things worse, but the doubts had been eating me alive for weeks now, and I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for the phone, my hand trembling slightly as I turned it over. The screen lit up, and there it was, a message sitting at the top of her notifications. "Sis you, babe. Tonight was incredible. Can't wait to see you again. So Alex." My stomach dropped. I stared at the message, my mind scrambling to make sense of it, trying to convince myself that there was some kind of explanation, some reasonable excuse. But there wasn't. The truth was right there, staring back at me from that tiny glowing screen. I unlocked her phone, the password, something I had figured out months ago when the first seeds of doubt had been planted. I hated myself for doing it, hated that I had let things get this far. But the second I opened her messages, I knew there was no going back. There were dozens of texts, some from earlier in the day, some from the night before. The words blurred together as I scrolled through them, each one a fresh dagger to my gut. "You're amazing. Last night was perfect. Can't stop thinking about you. So I'll meet you at the hotel again tomorrow. Same room, same time. Hotel. A goddamn hotel." I couldn't breathe. My head was spinning, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I felt like I was going to be sick, like the whole world had tilted on its axis, and I was the only one left standing in the ruins. I scrolled further back, reading every disgusting, heart-wrenching detail. The meetings, the sex, how she couldn't wait to be with him again. It wasn't just some fling. It wasn't a mistake. Brianna was having a full-blown affair, and she had been lying to me for God knows how long. Everything we had rebuilt, all the promises we had made, the life we had tried to create with Maggie and Stokely, it was all a lie. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those messages, feeling the weight of betrayal crush me from the inside out. But it could be minutes or hours for all I knew. My whole world had just come crashing down around me, and I was stuck in the wreckage, unable to move, unable to think. But eventually, the anger came. It burned through the numbness, turning every bit of pain into something darker, something that roared in my chest like wildfire. I slammed the phone down on the table, the sound echoing through the empty kitchen. That's when Maggie appeared. She must have heard the noise, or maybe she had just sensed that something was wrong. Either way, she stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her face hard. "What happened?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp, like she already knew the answer. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even look at her. All I could do was gesture toward the phone, my hand trembling with rage. So Maggie stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she picked it up and looked at the screen. It only took her a few seconds to understand. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her expression going from confusion to anger to something much colder. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were like ice. "I told you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I told you she was lying, so I didn't need to hear it. I didn't need anyone to tell me how wrong I had been. All the warning signs, all the doubts I had ignored, they were crashing over me now, drowning me in guilt and shame." The Maggie stood there, waiting for me to say something, but what could I say? What could I possibly do to make this right? "She's meeting him at some hotel," I finally muttered, my voice hoarse. So all those nights, all those late meetings. So Maggie didn't respond. She didn't have to. The silence between us said everything. She set the phone down carefully, then turned to me, her face softening just a little. "What are you going to do, Mac?" she asked, her voice steady, like she was preparing for whatever came next. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, betrayal and pain. What was I going to do? Confront her? Scream? Walk out and never look back? A part of me wanted to throw everything in her face to make her feel the same kind of hurt she had inflicted on me. But another part of me was just tired. Tired of the lies, the betrayal, the endless cycle of trying to make things work when they were already broken beyond repair. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, my hands still shaking as I buried my face in them. "I don't know," I muttered. "I don't fucking know." Maggie stood there for a moment longer, then quietly left the room. She didn't offer any advice, didn't try to push me one way or another. She knew this was something I had to figure out for myself. And that was the thing, wasn't it? I had to figure this out. I had to decide what came next, how I was going to deal with the wreckage of everything I had once believed in. Or as I sat there, my mind swirling with the weight of it all, one thing was crystal clear. This wasn't just about Brianna anymore. It wasn't just about me. It was about Maggie and Stokely too, and I couldn't let them down. Sick or die hard to do not something. I just didn't know what that was yet. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, the images from those texts haunted me, playing over and over in my head like a broken record. I kept seeing Brianna, with him this faceless man. Alex, who had somehow wormed his way into my wife's life, into our marriage. I kept replaying every moment over the last few months, every late night excuse, every half-hearted smile she'd given me when she came home from work. How had I been so blind? How had I let it get this far without seeing what was right in front of me? By the time the sun came up, I was a wreck. My hands shook as I made coffee, the bitterness of it doing little to steady my nerves. I kept looking at the front door, half expecting Brianna to come strolling in like nothing had happened, like she hadn't spent the night in some hotel bed with him, or she didn't come home that morning. I sat there for hours waiting, hoping that she'd walk through the door so I could confront her, get them right this way. But the house stayed quiet, and with each passing minute, the anger inside me grew. I needed to do something. I needed to take control of the situation before it consumed me. It was close to noon when I finally made up my mind. I couldn't just sit there and wait for her to come home on her own time, as if I was some passive bystander in my own life. I grabbed my jacket, checked the messages on her phone one more time to see where she might be, and then head out. If she wasn't going to come to me, I'd find her myself. I drove around town, my mind in a haze of rage and betrayal. I stopped by her office first, though I knew it was a long shot. Sure enough, the receptionist told me Brianna hadn't come in today. No surprise there. It wasn't until I hit the edge of town that I found what I was looking for, a small, nondescript hotel just off the highway, the kind of place you'd stop at if you were trying to keep things quiet. I sat in the parking lot for a long time, staring at the entrance, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. I had found them. I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. A part of me wanted to storm in there, tear the place apart until I found them, and drag Brianna out in front of everyone. Another part of me just wanted to leave, to turn around and pretend like none of this was happening. But I couldn't. I couldn't just walk away. Not now. I got out of the car, my legs feeling like lead as I made my way to the front desk. The clerk barely glanced at me, too absorbed in his computer to care about the look of fury on my face. The guy didn't bother with pleasantries. "So is there a Brianna booked here?" I asked, my voice tight. The clerk finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "We don't give out guest information." I cut him off, leaning in close enough that he could see I wasn't in the mood for games. "I'm her husband," I snobbed. "I know she's here. Room number." Now, maybe it was the look in my eyes, or maybe he just didn't get paid enough to deal with my shit, but he hesitated for only a second before typing something into his computer. "Room 214, he muttered, barely making eye contact. "Second floor." I didn't thank him. I was already moving, my feet pounding up the stairs, my hands clenched into fists. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there. I wasn't even sure I wanted to know what I'd find behind the door, but I couldn't stop myself, not now. The hallway on the second floor was empty, and the only sound was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Room 214 was at the end of the corridor, the door shut tight. For a moment I just stood there, staring at the numbers, trying to catch my breath, trying to summon the strength to knock. But I didn't need to. Before I could even raise my hand, the door opened, and there she was. "It's Brianna. Hey, Brianna." She froze when she saw me, her eyes widening in shock. For a split second, I saw panic flash across her face before she composed herself, her expression hardening into something colder, more calculated. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't expected me to find her. She hadn't thought I would follow her here. Behind her, I could see him. Alex. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, shirtless, his hair tousled like he had just woken up. When he saw me, he stood up slowly, his expression unreadable, like he wasn't sure if I was going to hit him or just walk away. For a long moment, none of us moved. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Brianna was the first to break the silence. "So," she said, her voice low, like she was trying to find the right words. "I didn't." Don't, I snapped, cutting her off. Don't you dare try to explain this. She closed her mouth, her eyes narrowing, and for the first time, I saw the real Brianna, the woman who had been lying to me for months, who had walked out of our marriage and straight into another man's bed. To woman who had shattered everything we had built without a second thought. Alex stood up, stepping around Brianna like he was trying to defuse the situation. He was tall, muscular, the kind of guy who clearly spent too much time in the gym. There was something about him that made my blood boil, the way he looked at me like I was the intruder in his world. Well, you need to leave, he said, his voice calm, but with an edge to it. This is between me and her. Top did it. All the anger, all the pain, all the betrayal had all boiled over in that moment. Before I could even think about what I was doing, I lunged at him. My fist connected with his jaw, the sound of bone hitting bone reverberating through the room. He staggered back, crashing into the nightstand, knocking over a lamp. "Oh," Brianna screamed, grabbing at my arm, trying to pull me off him, but I was too far gone. The rage had taken over, and all I could see was red. I hit him again, harder this time, the impact sending him sprawling onto the floor. "Such you son of a bitch," I shouted, my voice hoarse with fury. "You think you can just waltz in and take what's mine? You think you can just fuck my wife and get away with it?" Alex groaned, clutching his jaw as he tried to get up. But I wasn't finished. I grabbed him by the collar, dragging him to his feet, my fist raised to strike again. But then Brianna was in front of me, shoving me back, her eyes wild with fear. "Stop it," she screamed, her voice shaking. "Stop it, Mac. This isn't going to fix anything." I froze, my chest heaving, my fist still clenched. The look on her face, it was like she didn't even recognize me anymore, so maybe I didn't recognize myself either. Alex slumped back against the bed, his hand pressed to his bleeding lip, glaring at me with a mix of anger and fear. Brianna stood between us, her hands raised like she was trying to keep a wild animal at bay. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, Mac." But it didn't matter. The damage was done. Whatever we had built, whatever we had tried to rebuild, it was gone now, shattered beyond repair, and no amount of apologies or explanations could change that. Yet I stepped back, my fists lowering as the adrenaline drained from my body, leaving me feeling hollow, empty. Brianna reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away, the disgust and betrayal too fresh, too raw. "I trusted you," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I fucking trusted you." She didn't respond. She just stood there, tears welling up in her eyes. But I didn't care, or couldn't care, not anymore. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving Brianna and Alex behind. The door slammed shut behind me, and with it, the last remnants of whatever hope I had left for us. As I walked down the hallway, my mind numb and my heart shattered, I realized that this wasn't just the end of our marriage. This was the end of everything. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember much of it, just the sound of the engine, the steady hum of the tires on the road, and the weight pressing down on my chest, growing heavier with every mile that passed. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, I thought it might snap in half. But the rage that had consumed me in that hotel room was gone now, replaced by something colder, something emptier. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the house. Everything felt different now. The world outside my window looked the same, the familiar shape of the oak tree in the yard, the way the evening light hit the front porch, but I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Not for me. Not for Maggie and Stokely. Not for the family I had so desperately tried to hold together. I sat in the car for a while, staring at the house, trying to summon the strength to go inside. I knew Maggie would be waiting. She'd want to know what happened, what I had done, what came next. I didn't have the answers. Hell, I didn't even know how to begin to explain what had just unfolded. Eventually, I forced myself out of the car. The cool evening air hit me like a slap to the face, jolting me back to reality. My legs felt heavy as I made my way to the front door, my heart pounding with a dull, persistent ache. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the same suffocating silence that had been there the night before. Maggie was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed. She looked up the second I walked in, her eyes narrowing as she took in my disheveled appearance, the blood on my knuckles, the wild look in my eyes. She didn't say anything at first, just waited, her face unreadable. I stood there for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain what had happened? How could I make sense of something that had ripped my life apart at the seams? "She's cheating," I finally muttered, my voice raw and hoarse. "She's been cheating on me." Maggie didn't react right away. She just stared at me, her expression hardening into something cold, something fierce. I could see the anger in her eyes, the same anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. But there was no surprise. She had known. "I told you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I fucking told you." I nodded, sinking down into one of the chairs at the kitchen table. My whole body felt like it had been wrung out, drained of every ounce of energy, every emotion. While I couldn't even summon the strength to argue with her, she was right. She had been right from the beginning, and I had been too hanged and I had been too desperate to see it. "I found them," I said after a long pause, my voice barely more than a whisper. At a hotel, together. Offer. His lips curled into a tight, bitter smile. Of course you did. So I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to wipe away the exhaustion, the guilt, the anger that was still clinging to me like a second skin. I hit him. I hit him more than once. For the first time, Maggie's expression softened just a little. Just a little. It didn't make you feel better. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. No, it didn't change a damn thing. She leaned back in her chair, studying me for a moment before speaking again. What are you going to do now? That was the question, wasn't it? What was I going to do now? Brianna was out of my life. There was no coming back from what I had just witnessed, but what about everything else? What about Maggie and Stokely? What about the future we had started to build together? I don't know, I admitted, my voice hollow. I don't know what the hell I'm supposed to do. Ida didn't respond right away. She just sat there, watching me, her expression unreadable. After a long silence, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. You need to think about the girls, Mac. You need to think about Stokely. I looked up at her, feeling a fresh wave of guilt wash over me. Stokely. She had no idea what was happening, no clue that the life we had promised her was crumbling before her eyes. She had been through enough already, too much for someone her age, and now I was dragging her through another storm. Maggie was right. I had to pull it together, for Stokely, if nothing else. I had made a promise to her, to both of them, and I wasn't going to let Brianna's betrayal destroy that. I'll figure it out, I said quietly. I'll do whatever I have to make sure you two are okay. Maggie's gaze softened just a little, the hard edge fading from her eyes. Good. Because she needs you, Mac. We both do. He piped. I nodded, but deep down, I wasn't sure how much I had left to give. The weight of everything was crushing me, suffocating me, and I didn't know how to carry it all. I had to try. For Stokely. For Maggie. For myself? I stood up, feeling the weight of exhaustion pull at my limbs. I'm going to check on Stokely, I muttered, more to myself than to Maggie. She just nodded, her expression softening further. She's in her room, drawing like always. I walked down the hall to Stokely's room, my heart heavy with everything that had happened, everything that was still unraveling. When I knocked gently on the door, she didn't respond, so I pushed it open quietly. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers and colored pencils, her focus entirely on the drawing in front of her. Hey, kiddo, I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. Stokely looked up, her eyes wide and innocent, so different from the chaos swirling inside me. She smiled, that shy little smile she always gave when she was lost in her art. Hey, Mac. So I walked over and sat down beside her, glancing at the drawing she was working on. It was a sketch of a house, simple and sweet, with two stick figures standing in front of it, one big, one small. So family, a home, everything I had promised her. How's the drawing coming? I asked, forcing a smile. She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face for something, though I wasn't sure what. It's good, she said quietly. Is everything okay? I swallowed hard, trying to push the weight of my emotions down, trying not to let her see how broken I felt. Yeah, kiddo, I lied. Everything's going to be okay. She didn't question me. She just nodded and went back to her drawing, her world still safe, still untouched by the storm that had ripped through mine. And I stayed with her for a while, just sitting there in the quiet, watching her draw, trying to hold on to whatever small piece of peace I could find. But for a moment it almost felt normal, almost like things could be okay again, even if just for a little while. But deep down I knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same. Not after what Brianna had done, not after everything that had been shattered. I had lost her. I had lost the life we had tried to rebuild. But maybe, just maybe, I could still salvage something from the wreckage. Maybe I could still give Maggie and Stokely the life they deserved. Maybe I could still find a way to move forward, even if the road ahead was darker than I had ever imagined. I just had to figure out how to keep walking,